lies, prison, and the favor of God. I mean to consider those three things as they relate to Joseph's experience in this section. He was the butt end of a series of lies. He became a prisoner in Egypt's most consequential and serious prison. And we are told that he also had the favor of God and the presence of God through all of this, directing his path and turning hearts toward him for good. It's a strange combination. Although it's a combination that fits what seems to have been the theme of our meeting today, and that is God's grace and presence and love in the midst of and sometimes even in the form of sorrow that he brings our way. Most settings in a church today, we would not find all those things put together. We tend to think of hardship as the lack of God's favor, and when things go our way, when it's sunshine and roses and rainbows, as though God is truly smiling upon us. But in this text, we're confronted with the simultaneous experience for Joseph of being lied about, accused falsely, being thrown in prison, and also, during that whole time, experiencing the overwhelming favor of God. And I hope to wrap our minds around that and to make sure that we understand the details of the text and the things that are happening as we go today. So that's where we'll be. I think these things are the plain meaning of this passage. We are not today, under no circumstances, are we going to get to the end of Joseph's story this week. That's not going to happen. There's a lot that happens. There's so many more chapters. And so we can't get a proper, realizing that, we need to realize for ourselves, we're not going to properly understand all of Joseph's stories and how every detail, and even how this section will finally be used by God until we get to the end. But along the way, Moses' intention is not for us to just suspend judgment on everything he tells us and just, kind of hold everything very loosely and wait to the very end and then try to figure it all out. There are many lessons for us to learn along the way, conclusions we can make, applications for our own lives as we go. And so we want to be careful and not, say too much and not get ahead of the story. But there are some plain things that Moses expects for us to understand as he writes, and those things have a big application for us as Christians. So with that said, I would like to do a very brief review of some things we've seen so far about this chapter, and then we will read our text today and dive in. The last time we considered this chapter, we looked at verses 1 through 10, and we noted there three main features. First was the faithfulness of Joseph. Joseph was faithful both to Potiphar and to God. To Potiphar, Joseph was faithful as a slave, just as he had been faithful in his service to his father, Jacob, in the Promised Land, back when he was a shepherd and a son. And he had been, we remember, kind of the picture of the ideal son in his faithfulness to his father and the quality of service he had rendered him. But here in Egypt, Joseph was working diligently and carefully and wisely and faithfully in all that he was given to do. But as a servant to God, Joseph was also faithful, and that one we can miss if we're not careful. And we fleshed that out by, first of all, realizing who Potiphar was, that Potiphar had a name who meant belonging to Ra, which was kind of the primary deity in the Egyptian false system of religion. And so his name means belonging to Ra. And so we're told he was not a foreign-born person who was brought to Egypt and given a name, but rather he was an Egyptian. He was brought up from his childhood in this, given this name, and this is all he's known. And he's so invested in this that he has actually he's risen to a high rank. He's become captain of the guard. And so we looked at that name, and it was kind of we looked at the word for guard. It also could mean butcher. And that this idea was that they were executioners, and so they had the power of the sword for sure. And so he is captain of a group of men who act as Pharaoh's palace guards, his bodyguards, and his personal soldiers. And so as king, as dictator, all soldiers kind of belonged to him. But these weren't just men who were part of his army. These were kind of the local people who were in charge of protecting and enforcing the king's will. And Potiphar, we know as captain of the guard, is also the man who is in charge of the prison where he throws Joseph here later. That is on his grounds. When Pharaoh gets angry with these two men, these two servants of his later on, and throws them into prison, he throws them into the prison of the captain of the guard. That's Potiphar. And so Potiphar is very close to Pharaoh. He's risen up the ranks. He's very much an Egyptian man. But this Egyptian man finds himself praising Yahweh as the reason for why things are going so well in his home under Joseph's care. And that tells me that Joseph has been faithful to God this whole time. He didn't get to Egypt and say, you know what, God's treated me this way. I'm done with him. What can I get out of these gods from Egypt? He remained true for what looks like about a decade in Potiphar's house as he slowly rose through the ranks and got to the place where he was in charge of everything, and Potiphar only had to do with concerning himself with such mundane things to a rich man as the things that he ate. But everything else was in Joseph's charge, and Potiphar's explanation for why things were going so well, this is Potiphar's explanation, not just Moses, this is Potiphar's, is that Yahweh had been blessing the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. That's profound. I don't know, how long you've maybe been at your job, but let's say you've been there a decade, and do people who know you know that things work out in your life the way they do because of God? Most of us would say maybe there's a few people who we've had significant conversations with, but for the most part, there aren't many people that we work with, that we rub shoulders with, who really know much about our Christian faith. That's just the way things seem to go. There are some, but not lots. Maybe they know you profess to be a Christian. Maybe everyone knows that. But how much have you talked with them such that they, despite their own religious beliefs, would themselves come to the conviction and the settled belief that your God is actually active in your life and doing things in your life, and that they have benefited from that? That is, we're told that this was the conviction of Potiphar. It's quite a thing. Verse 3 says, his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. And the word for Lord there is, again, it's Yahweh. Pharaoh saw that it was Yahweh who was with Joseph, and it was Yahweh who caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. That's profound. So Joseph has been a picture of faithfulness. The second thing that we noticed and highlighted was the favor that God gave Joseph in Potiphar's eyes. So not only was Joseph faithful, but then God gave Joseph tremendous favor in Potiphar's eyes. That is, he turned Potiphar toward him in his heart in ways that Potiphar did not care about his other slaves. I don't know how many slaves Potiphar might have had. You know, he's very high up, so he's a wealthy man in Egypt, and maybe he was as wealthy in slaves as we tend to think of our, southern plantation owners. The picture is always hundreds of slaves, and of course that wasn't generally the reality, but that was the idea. Maybe Potiphar had many, many slaves. We know he had many free men who worked for him because he was captain of the guard. But he likely had many slaves. But he didn't care for any of those slaves the way he cared for Joseph, because God gave him favor. Verse 4, so Joseph found favor in his sight. What a thing. God gave him favor in Potiphar's sight. He favored Joseph highly. He entrusted Joseph with so much. He favored him, again, to the extent that he put everything in his charge, and the only thing he concerned himself with was the most inconsequential kinds of things for a rich man, is the type of food that he eats. That's a big deal to get to that place as a slave. I couldn't imagine. Let's put it this way. It's one thing for Pharaoh later in Genesis, in this story, to tell Joseph, well, there'll be no distinction between you and me. Everyone will just do what you say, except for, I have the throne. You don't have that. Pharaoh's not accountable to anyone else. If things go badly, Pharaoh's accountable to Pharaoh. I mean, who's going to challenge Pharaoh? But if things go badly for Potiphar, he's got to answer to Pharaoh. And so for him to turn over everything that he does to Joseph and just say, you just do what you want, I'm just going to worry about my diet, is a big deal. That's a massive amount of trust that he has to put in Joseph. Massive amount of favor that Joseph has and confidence that Potiphar has in him. And so the answer to this is God did this. God gave him that position. God caused this to happen. So he's got all this favor. The third thing we noticed was Joseph's fear of God. We've been primarily looking at Joseph. These are the things we considered. That he was faithful, that he had the favor, that God gave him favor in the eyes of his master, and then Joseph was full of the fear of God. We saw that when confronted with a very great temptation. This is a classic text to consider. People always go to this text to consider sexual temptation and that sort of thing. And the odd thing is, most people, I don't know of any man who's ever had this form of temptation where his master's wife was just so lustful for him that she was constantly after him and berating him and looking for opportunities to be with him, and then actually physically grabbed him and tried to force the issue. But that was the situation he was in. And in that situation, he resisted temptation with 3 reasons. And the first reason was that Potiphar it would be a betrayal of Potiphar's trust. The second reason was that it would anger, rightly, Potiphar and be a sin that way against Potiphar. But the third reason, the most important one, was Joseph's fear of God. He says in verse 9, "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" It would have been easy to think of himself as distant from God's promises and the promised land and his family and all that God had promised would happen. And here he is in Egypt. He's risen through the ranks and he's got this opportunity with this woman. And why not take it? It would be easy, wouldn't it? I mean, think of the pressure upon him. He's a servant of Potiphar. He's a slave in Potiphar's house. And then the master's wife is saying, "Look, slave, I'm telling you, do this. Take your body and do this with it. Because I'm commanding you to." She issued it to him as a command. She didn't try to persuade him. She just said, "Lie with me." And he's refusing. What if she were to turn and start bad-mouthing him to Potiphar, as later happens, in the worst possible way, as we'll see. But there's pressure on him to do this. It's not just that there's just the average sort of sexual temptation of a woman who's trying to do this with him, but there's even cultural pressure because he's a slave and she is the master's wife. And so there's this issue as well. But we see his fear of God. He was motivated chiefly by his fear of God and his love of God and the conviction that God was with him and had been blessing him all this time. How could he go then turn and sin against God? It ought to remind you a bit of Job. And he says to his wife, "Shall we not accept good and evil from the Lord?" I mean, the Lord had blessed Job so much, with so much, and then he took it away, and you could call it evil or bad things, we might say, had happened to Job recently. And so Job says, look, we need to accept both from God. And here is Joseph, and he's saying, look, the idea is God has done all this to me. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against him? He's the reason things are going well. I can't sin against him. In all these ways, Joseph has been a model of godly and righteous character. His conduct has been pure. His motivations have been right. He's been an example for us. But we come then to this text today, verses 11 through 23, 11 through the rest of the chapter. And I want to, before we dive in, just to give a brief overview. Again, I said we are looking at three main things this time: lies, prison, and the favor of God. All these things in Joseph's experience. So let me just state them briefly. In Joseph's experience, he is about to be lied about once again. It happened before. Remember when his brothers told their father he was dead. But now it will happen again. And once more, the lie will go unchecked. It will be unchallenged, even if only half believed. More on that later, about this lie being maybe just half believed. So there's lies. There's prison. Don't allow yourself to forget this was a real prison. I think we tend to think, well, Joseph gets sold into slavery, but God's with him, and he rises to power, and it's just great. And then he gets cast in prison, but since God is with him, he rises to power, and his life is good. This is not that kind of prison. I mean, you can be above the other prisoners, but you're still a prisoner, and you're never allowed to forget that. It was the place where Pharaoh would put those he was angered at to punish them, and where men awaited to find out if they would be executed or not. It's not a pleasant place to be. And then lastly, just consider the favor of God. He has the favor of God. The text doesn't allow us to escape this. Both before the before the temptation, we are told, verse 2, think of this in this chapter, verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, so God is with him. Verse 3, his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. Verse 5, from the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and field. So you see here, at the front end of this chapter, all this talk about God's blessing. And then let's look at verse 21, at the end of the chapter. But the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him steadfast love, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And then verse 23, the keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. I read all that to say, at the beginning of the story and at the end of this chapter, this section, Moses goes out of his way to tell us God was with him, God caused all that he did to succeed. And that's fine to hear that, but then when you read that in the middle, he was lied about, falsely accused, and thrown in prison, it just doesn't seem to make sense. I mean, it makes sense to read that God was with him and caused everything that he did to succeed. But it's hard to picture God was with him and he was falsely accused, the accusation stuck, he was thrown in prison. We want to say, well, he was vindicated. You know, he was falsely accused, and then Potiphar threw him in prison, and then Potiphar discovered it was a lie and got him out, and his wife got her just desserts. But that's not how the story reads. And so, all three of these things existed in his life simultaneously. So let's then look at the text and begin to flesh it out. I want to back up to the first half of verse 6 and read down through the end of verse 10, just to make sure we remember some of this. I think we have to consider once more, however briefly, these verses, and remind ourselves once more of Joseph's steadfastness in the face of this temptation, and of the care that he took to avoid temptations to sin. We read now, Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. So we read all about the favor of God and how things have been going so well, but there was also this other thing you need to know about Joseph. He was handsome in form and appearance. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or even to be with her. Now, Joseph again is a model for us here. I mean, he doesn't give in. This happens day after day. I mean, he's required to go into the house to do his work. He's a slave. He doesn't get a choice in the matter. It's not like he can go find it. It's not like you or I, who maybe we're in a situation like that in our job, and we say, I'm going to find myself another job. That's not an option. If Joseph says, hey, I don't want to do the job anymore, then he gets whipped. This isn't an option. And so he goes to do his job. He's a slave. This is what's been put in his charge. He has to go. And he goes into the house to do his job. And while he's there, every opportunity she gets, Potiphar's wife is speaking to him, trying to get him to lie with her. Lie with me, she says, again and again. But Joseph does not even listen to her. So there's the initial plead from her, lie with me, and he refused, and he gives these reasons, but then it doesn't end. It just continues day after day, year after year. She would speak to Joseph, but he wouldn't listen to her. And it got to the point where he wouldn't listen to her to lie beside her. He wouldn't even be with her. He did what he could to avoid her entirely, to just get away, because this is trouble, and he knows it. And for years, he's stood fast in this way. And he's faithfully served Potiphar, he's faithfully served God, and he's avoided the temptation. But, verse 11, one day, when he went into the house to do his work, none of the men of the house was there in the house. So this time he goes in, and maybe she'd summoned them out, all of them. Or maybe he came at a time when maybe no one's usually there, but in 5 minutes they arrive from their whatever the work they're doing in the garden on the property, or whatever it may be. But somehow, he went in to do his normal work, but unusually, all the men of the house were not there in the house. And what did she do? She caught him. Caught him. It doesn't say she enticed him. She called him into the room, and he came in. No, he was not willing to be around her. She caught him. This is so bizarre. I mean, I've got 6 children, and they play games around the house, and sometimes one of them catches another. And it never looks like it's always an awkward sort of thing. What is she doing? Is she around the corner behind the curtain, and he walks by, and she pounces upon him, and I've got you? I don't know. It's something like that. She catches him so that he's trying to get away, and she's got him. And she's got enough of a hold of him. In getting away, she has taken off his outer cloak, his outer garment. And he runs off. I mean, it's amazing. She caught him by his garment and says again, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, so this happened. He left the garment in her hand and he runs out. And then Moses tells us, as soon as she saw this. In other words, he's saying she got thinking about what's happened and how this looks. And then what did she do? She called to the men of her household, right there outside. He hollers at them to come in and said to them, see, he, that is her husband, has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled. And I got out of the house. And got out of the house. Then she laid it. What did she do then after she said that? Well, then she took the garment and laid it up by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. Whew. What a woman, huh? Let's consider these first two verses 11 and 12 for a little bit. Again, he goes in thinking that, to do his regular work. He's surprised, perhaps, to find the men who are usually stationed there aren't there. They're not in their spot. Well, maybe they were sent over here, maybe over there. He goes through the house to go about doing his work. He's not finding anyone there. She knows the house is empty. She knows his path through the house, where he's stationed, where he does most of his work, his routine. She's been watching him. She's had her eye on him for years now. And she catches him unexpectedly and says, "Lie with me," commands him again. And he runs. He left his garment in her hand. There's another place in the New Testament where a certain man tries to get away and leaves his garment in someone's hands. Anyone remember? It's sort of a humorous situation. Yeah, we're not sure for 100% who it is, but probably John Mark, running away the night of Jesus' arrest, and the Romans try to seize him, and he runs off, and it says naked. He just ran out of there, running for his life. And this is the way it is here with Joseph. I mean, you don't want to leave your clothing there. You could be accused, but you don't want to be there and have something worse happen. Better to be falsely accused about something you didn't do than to actually commit the sin, right? So he runs, leaves the garment in her hand. I mean, you can't tell me that he couldn't have wrestled it away from her. Surely he could have. Perhaps she would have been bruised in the process, something like that. I don't know. But he just gets out. He runs. He flees. He left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And I just would say, picture yourself as maybe another slave outside the house. You see Joseph go in, why? There are more slaves out of the house than are usually out of the house. Why did Potiphar's wife send them out? That's just odd. And then a few minutes later, Joseph comes running out, half clothed. What's going through your head? Something unsavory went on in there. Joseph's just running out, and he's just out here, and now what? I mean, I think everyone's assumption is that something happened between Potiphar's wife and Joseph has run out of there. Perhaps when you hear Potiphar's wife's story, you question it because it doesn't really seem to add up. Or maybe it provides at least something of an explanation. She calls you in and she tells you, well, this is what happened, this is why he ran out, because he was afraid that the reason he had that worried look on his face was because he was afraid that he was going to get caught. And now he's going to get caught, and he's going to have to suffer for it. And so maybe you believe her, maybe you don't. But Joseph has no recourse, and she's trying to convince you of her side of things. So she realizes this. She's there, and she knows this is not going to go well. She's about to come up with a story. If she's going to get out of this, if she's going to not be condemned as an adulteress, as a seductress, if she's not going to be, if she's not going to face consequences from Potiphar, then she's going to have to come up with a story. She assesses the situation and chooses the path of self-preservation rather than truth. It's quite a thing. As soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, and look how she lies and twists it around, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us." So first of all, she complains about her husband, the first thing she does. It's amazing. She spent the last decade trying to have an affair against her husband with this slave, and instead now that it's gone sour, she says, well, my husband brought this Hebrew among us to laugh at us. And that word to laugh at, it's a tricky word. It's a word we've come across a few other times in Genesis. One time it was... This was what Ishmael was doing to Isaac, right? He was laughing at him. He wasn't just laughing. He was mocking him. He was physically probably assaulting him. And this is what she's saying. My husband brought this Hebrew among us, what? To do this to us? To mock us? To abuse us in these ways? Look what he did. Look what he's done. My husband brought this man here, and he came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. He was going to rape me. I mean, this is what was happening. This is what she's saying. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. There's a law in Israel, many years after this, you can read about that if a man lies with a woman, she's married, and it's a populated area, there are people around that could hear, and none of them hear a scream, then because she didn't scream, because nobody heard a scream, she's guilty of adultery. But if any of them heard a scream, she's innocent. It's this kind of thing. The assumption is, look, if no one was there to protect you, you should have screamed out. You should have cried out. And that's what she did. She called to the men of the house. She didn't cry out in the midst of it. The only thing she cried out in the midst of things was to Joseph, lie with me. But now she's lying in another sense, and she's saying, well, this is what happened. He was going to come, and she tells them, I lifted up my voice. Do we read about her lifting up her voice? No, we just read that she says she lifted up her voice, which is amazing. So all the servants either have to say, she's lying, Potiphar, she did not lift up her voice. Or they have to say, well, maybe she did, but we just didn't hear it. So she claims she lifted up her voice, but she didn't. So she lies about this. It makes her appear more innocent. I cried out with a loud voice. We didn't hear it. Well, I did. Are you calling me a liar? You can see how this goes. And she says, as soon as Joseph heard that I lifted up my voice and I cried out, the operating assumption is he knew he was in trouble, and so he ran off and he left his garment beside me. Well, how did his garment get there? She ripped it off of him in truth, but she says he took it off and laid it beside me, forced himself upon me, and I screamed. And then he ran off. That's not how it happened. She reverses the order. He heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out. He left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Rather, it was she took the garment, he fled, and then she cried out. It's amazing. She twists it all around. So she does, for the first thing she does is she takes these servants who were innocent, ignorant of the situation, and primes the pump, in a sense, kind of primes the situation so that when she goes to talk to her husband, she has people who will corroborate her story. Right? Does that make sense? It's like a kid who breaks a window, maybe, and no one's around, and then before the parents get home, he tells the other kids, listen, this is all I was doing. This is what happened. So then the parents get home and they ask the other kids, oh yeah, that's what happened. It's like, they weren't witnesses. You're just trying to increase the likelihood that your lie would be believed. It's this sort of a thing. So that's what she's doing. Trying to gain witnesses for herself. Make it more believable. So what does she do then? The next step is verse 16. She laid up his garment by her until his master came home. So she made sure she kept it right there where it would look like right where he left it. She lays there and just waits. Right? An interesting thing. So there it was. She laid it up by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. Now, the way she talks here in verse 17 reminds me a lot of Adam in the garden. God says, have you eaten of the tree? Who told you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree? And he says, well, the woman whom you put here, whom you gave me, she gave me, and that's why I ate. And here she says, the Hebrew servant whom you brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. It's like she's blame shifting. She's saying it's your fault. You're half the problem. Not only did this Hebrew try to rape me, but you brought him here. So he's on the defensive already. She's crafty, right? This is a good strategy. It's not an honest one, but it's logistically it works out in the argument and for her to win her case and be believed. She's saying, look, you did this. And immediately he's going to say, it wasn't me. What did he do? I can't believe it. I'll straighten this out right away. So she gets him on the defensive. She accuses him. The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came into me to laugh at me, right? To mock me, to abuse me, to treat me in a way that's completely disrespectful. But I didn't let it happen. As soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. This is the second time now, not only that Joseph has been lied about, but the second time that his clothing, which was ripped off of him, has been used to lie about him. There is no way he doesn't equate these two. There's no way he doesn't see the similarity in this. That once again, for the second time in his life, Maybe the third time. Maybe when he became a slave and first got to Potiphar, his clothes were ripped off of him. But probably for the second time of his life, his outer garment was ripped off of him by somebody. And lo and behold, at the same time, somebody lies about him. Again. Before about his being dead, and now about something that his attempted rape. And they're so similar. It's remarkable. For his brothers, having the garment torn to pieces and all blood-soaked, removed them from suspicion and ensures that Jacob will believe that he is in fact dead and not go looking for him and asking questions. It just puts an end. This is proof. Right? They tell him, remember, recognize. And he says, surely some animal has killed him. And it does the similar thing for Potiphar's wife. Something to use as evidence against him. The garment itself is not enough, but coupled with her lies would be enough to convince Potiphar that this is likely the case and likely what happened. We'll read in verse 19, as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me. His anger was kindled. His anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. Now, this is a very curious 2 verses, because on the one hand it tells us that Potiphar was angry and incensed at the situation. His anger was kindled. He's mad at Joseph, and so he's going to punish him. And I would say Joseph should die, like any other slave would have died. But he didn't. And that's what's perplexing. He threw him into prison instead. Not just any prison, the prison that Potiphar himself was in charge of. Not directly, mind you. Potiphar had lots of responsibilities, and one of them was to keep the king's prison. And he puts him in that prison, which is why I think that the lie of Potiphar's wife might have only been half believed. Because it's enough to make you angry, but it doesn't even say he was angry at Joseph. It just says he was angered. And it says, I wonder if it's partly as if Potiphar's wife could have forces his hand. Potiphar either has to come out and say, I'm married to this lying adulteress, and I don't really have proof of it, but I'm going to accuse her, and I'm going to choose to believe this slave instead. Imagine the cultural pressure against that course of action. Or he can say, my wife is insisting that this happened. She's gathered up these other servants to give credence to her testimony. But all this goes in the face of everything I know about Joseph. I can't hardly believe that he's done this. But I don't have any evidence to the contrary. I don't have any choice but to punish him. To prison he goes. I think that's the scenario. He's angry, partly at Joseph. Maybe he's not sure if he should be angry at Joseph. He's angry with the situation that his wife has put him in. And he's angry just at the situation in general, and he's forced to do this. I mean, it would be enough to make him angry if Pharaoh came to Potiphar and said, hey, I know you've got this servant named Joseph, but the chief cupbearer has heard about him and he wants him. And so you have to let Joseph go and give him to the cupbearer. I would assume the text would say his anger was kindled because he's got a really good thing going with Joseph. He doesn't have to worry about anything but his food. And now, because he's got to get rid of Joseph, everything's changed. He's back to square one. And all the way that things have been going unexplainably good for the last 10 years is over because Joseph's not there anymore. And so it's a big concern. And there's a lot of reasons he could be angry. I don't think it's wrong to say that it's tied to this, that some of it's directed towards Joseph, but I don't think he's not concluded that Joseph was in fact at fault, and so he throws him into prison. That's, admittedly, I'm reading between the lines, but I can't fathom any reason he's not just killed. And so that's what I'm left with. You don't have to follow me there, but that's my own interpretation. We know also that Joseph had tremendous favor in Potiphar's eyes. We just had been reading about that. And this is amazing too. But despite all that affection that he has for Joseph, there are still cultural, practices that would keep him from taking Joseph's side against his wife, even if he believed Joseph and disbelieved his wife. And in order to illustrate that, I want to read something that I read this week that was written about slavery in the United States and the way that it worked. Admittedly, that's a different kind of slavery. This one was more racially motivated in America, but we also read here that Hebrew servant, that Hebrew slave you brought in. I mean, it's racial there too, to some extent. He's not an Egyptian. He's a foreign slave. Well, let me just read this. Enslaved African Americans could never forget their status as property, no matter how well their owners treated them. But it would be too simplistic to say that all masters and slaves hated each other. Human beings who live and work together are bound to form relationships of some kind, and some masters and slaves genuinely cared for each other, like Potiphar cared for Joseph. But the caring was tempered and limited by the power imbalance under which it grew. Within the narrow confines of slavery, human relationships ran the gamut from compassionate to contemptuous, but the masters and slaves never approached equality, right? He could like you all he wants, but you're still a slave. You're still property. We still own you. And you've caused this problem. And it's your word against her word. We never even read about anything Joseph said. It's this idea. There's this accusation. What's he to do? Potiphar doesn't even go to Joseph to ask. He just throws him in prison. His hands are tied. So in this context, you can easily see how the mere accusation that Joseph could have done this may have been enough. There wouldn't be an opportunity to prove your case or your innocence. You've been accused. There's some shred of evidence against you. It's enough. We're not going to overturn this. Whether I believe it or not, you're going to prison. So I don't think Potiphar entirely believed his wife, but he could not risk taking the slave seriously in the face of the testimony of his wife and the support that she had gotten by these other slaves. So that brings us now to verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. Joseph is in prison with lots of company. The king's enemies are there, right? We read that. But verse 20, and Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. So he's there with people who'd betrayed the king or upset the king for some reason or another. But mostly people who had, probably a bunch of rich people who were put in prison, and people who had risen through the ranks and gotten close enough to Pharaoh, but had misstepped and angered him and then thrown in prison. People who have very little in common with Joseph. But he's there with them. You might imagine some of them would resent him being put in charge of them while he's in prison. I think we often think of Joseph's story in concentric circles. Like he's out here serving Potiphar. He rises to power and then he falls. And he's thrown into the king's prison. He's closer to the king now. And then he rises again, right? And then it seems like he falls because he's forgotten in prison about those dreams. And then he's lifted up to Pharaoh's right hand. But really, this second stage is not a step forward, it's a step backward. He is already running basically there's a man who is captain of Pharaoh's guard right next to Pharaoh. And that guy, Joseph is his servant, and that guy is in a situation where he doesn't worry about anything. Joseph just does everything for him. So Joseph is very near to Pharaoh. I doubt very much he ever has any conversations with Pharaoh. Potiphar has those. But in terms of what Pharaoh wants, Potiphar just says, this is what he told me to do. I'm going to go eat. This is the idea. And so, from that position, one of the things Potiphar was in charge of was this prison. Joseph is still kind of in Potiphar's house. He's now in that prison. But within that prison, which used to be one of the many things that Joseph oversaw, now he just has this small role where he's in charge of things in the prison. But it's not just that he's in charge. It's just that he spends the least time in the cell. He's in charge in the sense that he's given, you do this, you do that, you do this, you do that. Anything it says whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. In other words, any task that you didn't just have every prisoner do, Joseph had to do. Any task that anyone who was in charge of the prison would normally have to do, it was unpleasant. It's not fun to be in charge of a dungeon. He had to do. So he's the one bringing the meals. He's the one cleaning the cells. Whatever it is, Joseph is the one doing it. So that the guy who's before his only job was just to keep care of this prison, he doesn't do anything. Joseph does it all. Now, on the one hand, it's a demonstration that Joseph had done all these things well. It always worked out. The prisoners maybe were in a better mood when Joseph was the one who came around. Things were going better. The Lord was with him. Whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. And the keeper of the prison realized this. But it's not as though it was just fun for Joseph. It's not like it was somehow like not being in prison. He was in prison. He later describes his entire time in Egypt as this was the land of his affliction. You would think he'd say it the opposite way. Right? When he names his boys, he says, I've forgotten, the Lord has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction here in Egypt. You would think, if I was Joseph, you would think he might describe the promised land as his land of affliction, where his brothers so mistreated him and hated him. He finally got away from them, and he started to rise to power. As soon as he got away from his brothers who hated him, as soon as he got around people who were neutral toward him and willing to see the best in him, he started rising to power. He's had it so well in Egypt, but it's been the opposite. This has been the land of his affliction. Both in prison and in Potiphar's house, he might have risen to power, but he was a slave, and he was never allowed to forget it. And here he is in prison, and he might be in charge, but at the same time, anything there is to do, Joseph's the one who has to do it. It's not pleasant there. So he's there with the king's enemies and prisoners. He is there with the keeper of the prison under Potiphar. But he's also there with God. And that made all the difference. Notice it says look at verses 20 and 21 in the contrast. And Joseph's master took him, seized him, and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. So, on the one hand, you think about the verbs that are used here. You've got this Potiphar man who grabs Joseph and takes him and puts him in prison. And there Joseph is with these other men, the king's prisoners. But also there with him, it says. But the Lord was with him and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. What a thing. God is there with him, showing him things, loving him, and giving him favor. Right? So the presence of God was there. And God was showing him steadfast love. And this is a curious thing to me. I asked the question of myself again and again as I looked at this text. How did God show him steadfast love in prison? What did it look like? And this is one of those statements that I think there are times that Scripture will tell you something and then give you examples. And there are other times where it just tells you and you're just supposed to understand what that means. And this is, I think, one of those times. He showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. So the Lord was with Joseph. Earlier we read in the chapter when God was with him that everything was succeeding. And he was having favor in the sight of his master. And here we read the Lord was with him, and we also read he was given favor in the sight of his master. Everything he did succeeded, and that's great. But this matter of steadfast love is a new one. We haven't read that yet in this chapter. And so I don't want to say that, because earlier when we read about God being with him and causing everything he did to succeed and giving him favor, Moses talked about that in ways that did not use the term steadfast love. But now at the end, he says those things again, but he also uses the term steadfast love. So I think we benefit if we don't say steadfast love just means those things. It's something different. In this added affliction came added mercy, added grace, something new. It's not that God wasn't loving towards him before, but that in this affliction, the thing that God was with him, and the leading thing that God did for him when he was there with him was to show him steadfast love. So then we could ask again, back to our question, what did it look like? What does it look like to be shown steadfast love while you're here in prison? There's another text in the Psalms that talks about the Word of God testing Joseph until all that God had said he would do came to pass. Joseph had this dream that his brothers were going to bow down to him, that his mother and his father, well, not his mother, that Leah, those boys' mother, and his own father would bow down to him. And it hadn't come to pass yet. But Joseph has also been raised to know God and to know God's promises and the things that God has been doing from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so there's all that in his mind. God has promised to do all these things, to do this thing through our family, the bunch of murderers and thieves that they are, my brothers, that is. And He's promised to do this. And He's shown me that I'm going to be in power in some way to bless them, to bring blessing. And none of it is coming to pass. And I think God comes to him, and in showing him steadfast love, encourages him, convinces him, persuades him those things are not lost. I care for you in little ways. Like you've read missionary biography of missionaries getting tossed in prison. You tell me, how is it that they talk about God showing them steadfast love? It's by the reminder of a verse, the conviction of some truth, the bringing of extra rations in answer to prayer. It's those strange things that are real and significant. An extra piece of fruit, a sun shining when it was cloudy all day and you got out to see the sun and suddenly you got to see the sunshine. It was the sound of a bird. It was those sorts of things at moments of absolute desperation and fear where the Lord would show him this steadfast love during his several years in prison. And it made all the difference. It was the reassurance to Joseph by God that God still had these purposes for him, that he was still, even in prison, serving the purposes of God, and that none of God's words would fail. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. I don't want to go any further today because if we do, we'll be in it for another hour. So what I want to do is just pause for the end of things here and make a little bit of application. The first thing is kind of what I let out with. It's just to think of these three things: lies, prison, and the favor of God. Being lied about, as a result of those lies, being thrown in prison wrongfully imprisoned, and experiencing the favor of God are not mutually exclusive. Just look at the story. All the way through, God is with him. They're not mutually exclusive, beloved, which means they're not exclusive. They're not mutually exclusive in your life, right? So when the clouds come, right, and it's the dark clouds and things are going as badly as they can go, and if we're honest, we typically say, where are you? Where's God? And I don't know that Joseph never asked that question. But in the midst of those questions, in the midst of the hardship, God was with him, showing him steadfast love. It's profound. It's a lesson as every believer learns, every believer has to learn, because God's process with us is not one of, it's not an easy one. It's through many trials, many temptations, many hardships we must enter the kingdom. Many of those things are things that God brings, that God chooses to bring about into our lives. They're not just things that are happenstance that just kind of worked out that way, and we hope God would deliver us from them. They're things God brings us into very deliberately, very willfully. Remember Joseph, of course, he says at the end of this whole thing, his brothers meant it for evil, God meant it for good. Every step along the way, God was working in Joseph's life. He was with him. You can't say God was with him in Potiphar's house and he was with him in Pharaoh's house. He's also with him in prison. I mean, this is the passage. He's in prison and God is with him. It's not just the easy times. So we all know that. It sounds trite to say it, but when you read this story and you think about Joseph's experience, it's not trite anymore. It applies. It's real. The other application is this. I'm not sure I've got the best way to say it, but what I want to say is that dedication to God, we saw earlier when Joseph was tempted, his fear of God sort of steeled him, strengthened him against temptation. I think in this text we see that God's presence will comfort and strengthen you in the midst of accusation and hardship. So let me say that again. Earlier we saw dedication to God and fear of God strengthened Joseph against temptation. All the reasons he could give about reasons not to sin against Potiphar can be reasoned out of. Well, Potiphar won't find out. But this one, fear of God, you can't get away from that. That was the thing that strengthened him against temptation with Potiphar's wife. But now that he's in prison, the temptation will be to give way to self-despair, hopelessness, resentment, anger. But instead, none of those things take root in Joseph's heart because God's presence was there, comforting him, showing him love, strengthening him in the midst of these false accusations and all this false imprisonment, the hardships he endured. They're different kinds of things, right? I mean, one is this outward temptation, and whatever desire you might have for it, you remind yourself of the truths of God and who God is, and the character of God, and the things you know about Him, and you say, I won't sin against Him. You think of His kindness to you, and you say, I can't do it. But this other sense is everyone's abandoned you, you're left totally alone, and it's not just truths about God you're reminding yourself of, it's God actually comes, He actually ministers to you. His presence, you feel it, you sense it, you realize it in ways you didn't before. God actually comes. And He's with you, and you know it. And the fact that He's with you, sometimes that's enough, isn't it? Sometimes they say misery loves company. Sometimes just having someone to go through it with. Right? Right, husbands, right? Myself included. Wife comes to you with a problem. It's not always, sometimes it's just, she just wants to know you're with her in the thing, right? And that's what it is sometimes. You need somebody to share this with. As Christians, I mean, we know this. Part of fulfilling the law of Christ, to love one another, is what? Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Just getting in there and being with them in the burden is enough, a lot of times. Well, there are good ways to be with someone in a burden and bad ways. And it just so happens that God is with him in a good way, to comfort him, to assure him, to minister to him, to show him love, to give him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison, to somehow to ease the burden a little bit, and to strengthen him in the midst of all that he's facing. We can be so grateful that when Jesus ascended, He tells the disciples before He goes, I'm going to send the Comforter to you. What a thing. Like he can. It's one thing for him to say, listen, it's only through many trials and temptations and hardships that you must enter the kingdom of God. And we think, I'll do my best. I really want it. But in that, He also has sent you a comforter. What a thing. And He also, more than that, has equipped other believers with truth and with love for you to also comfort you, to walk through this thing with you. In every way, God is with you in the trial. He's personally there in the form of His Spirit, reminding you of His truths, and in a way that we can't quite put in words, is comforting you directly in a way that you sense, but that it's hard to explain. In ways that the atheist or the skeptic might explain away as coincidence this time or that time, but you know is God. And in addition to that, if you are around other believers, God has also put in their heart a love for you and a desire to help you, and He's even commanded them to do those things. He has taken such good care of you, beloved. He's with you in the hardship. Just as truly and as really as He was with Joseph in the prison, He's with us. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. And this, again, strengthens us in the midst of the accusation and the hardship. So those two applications. Number one, these things are not mutually exclusive. Being lied about, being wrongly imprisoned, and having God's smile upon you the whole time. That's a real experience. That's the way things work many times. And then also, the application is just to know that God's presence is with us, and it's there to comfort us, to strengthen us, to convince us of His love. That's the whole point. That's what we see, how we see God dealing with Joseph here. The payoff for Joseph is not he gets to serve in Pharaoh's house in a few more years. The payoff for Joseph is he gets to preserve his family alive and further the purposes of God and be the blessing that God said He would be to them in time. That's the payoff. It's a lot of chapters until we get there, but that's it. And the ultimate payoff is just that Joseph himself would know God more, would know Him better, and would, again, be an instrument in all that God's doing in redemption. Well, that's what I have to say today about this section of Joseph's part in redemption. Anyone have any questions or comments?